Ancient history was dictated by a rigid geographic equation. It began in the flat alluvium of Mesopotamia and ended against the towering Zagros rock walls. These cultivated fields show the Mesopotamian caloric engine in action. Fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, this terrain produced grain and mud on a scale that could sustain massive populations and support the first cities. However, an abundance of mud and wheat creates a civilization with a critical vulnerability. It is structurally impoverished. Within the Fertile Crescent, there was a total absence of essential building materials. Kings had calories, but they lacked timber for roofs, stone for monuments, and the metals required for bronze weaponry. These sunlit rock walls provided the solution. Rising sharply from the plains, the Zagros Mountains functioned as the geographic bottleneck of the ancient world. Elam leveraged this position to maintain a structural monopoly on the minerals and timber required by the lowlands. To build a temple or arm a phalanx, Sumerian and Babylonian kings were forced to trade with the Elamite highlands. Geography effectively positioned the Zagros as the master of the plains. Moving these resources down to the plains involved immense topographical friction. Every ton of stone or timber required a massive expenditure of energy to navigate the mountain inclines. Highland industry was equally demanding. Smelting copper required a concentration of labor and a tolerance for the toxic gases released during the process. This diagram tracks the macroeconomic exchange. Caloric wealth flowed up the elevation gradient from Mesopotamia, while structural materials flowed down to the cities. Control over specific mountain passes gave Elam immense leverage, manipulating the downward-flowing minerals to influence the lowlands' political landscape. This cylinder seal and its clay impression demonstrate the bureaucratic complexity required to manage this system. Trade was not a series of random encounters, but a highly organized, systemic administration. Elamite officials could effectively regulate the expansion of Mesopotamian cities by adjusting the trade premiums on stone and copper. Through this trade filter, Elam regulated the physical and economic growth of the entire Fertile Crescent for centuries. Lowland cities like Susa were only the visible edge of the civilization. The true center of gravity lay at Anshan, deep within the high-altitude terrain of the Zagros. Topographical friction makes centralized rule difficult. In the mountains, the speed of communication slows to a crawl, and military responses are delayed by the physical reality of the terrain. The traditional model of the all-powerful, centralized God-King struggles in this environment. Absolute decrees lose their force when they cannot reach isolated valleys. Mesopotamian and Egyptian governance relied on a rigid hierarchical pyramid. Power was concentrated at a single apex and distributed downward. This model contains a fatal vulnerability. When the apex is struck or the capital falls, the entire system loses its structural integrity and collapses. Geographic reality forced Elam to move away from this brittle model. Top-down rule is unsustainable in a landscape that physically segments its population. Survival in the Zagros required a political architecture that could endure even if its leadership was temporarily severed. The Elamite solution was a highly resilient, decentralized federal network. This system, the Sukkalmah architecture, functioned as a distributed network. Power was shared across nodes like Anshan, Awan, and Susa. A high king, a viceroy, and a prince shared authority, maintaining bidirectional communication, so no single individual held an absolute monopoly. The system further distributed its authority through matrilineal successions, weaving familial ties through the different regional nodes to maintain cohesion. This distribution acted as a survival mechanism. Local leaders could respond to lowland threats immediately without waiting for commands to travel up from the highland core. This decentralized architecture made Elam remarkably resistant to total conquest. If Susa was sacked, the network remained active. Pulses of authority traveled down from hidden highland nodes to eventually reignite and rebuild the lowland center. This network structure provided a defense as formidable as the mountain walls themselves. Mesopotamian scribes consistently depicted the Elamites as a chaotic, godless threat swarming down from the mountains. This relief documenting the sack of Susa in 646 BC represents the culmination of that narrative. King Ashurbanipal intended for this documentation to signal the total death of the Elamite state. The propaganda relied on a lowland logic that the total destruction of a city and the looting of its temples equated to the destruction of the nation. This depiction of Elamite leadership tells a different story. It shows a highly disciplined, ceremonial high society operating with a sophistication that matches their lowland neighbors. Viewed through the network model, the destruction of Susa in 646 BC was a localized failure. While Susa burned, the administrative and military apparatus in the highlands remained functional and out of reach of the Assyrian armies. Elam operated on a decentralized logic that centralized empires found difficult to comprehend, and they found it even harder to dismantle. This structural difference shaped Elamite military philosophy. Their campaigns rarely prioritized territorial expansion or the traditional markers of royal glory. Instead, their warfare focused on maintaining a state of thermodynamic equilibrium with the lowlands. Conflicts often coincided with moments when Mesopotamia accumulated significant excess wealth or sought to bypass the trade costs imposed by the highlands. Elamite incursions functioned as a mechanism to redistribute Mesopotamian caloric wealth back to the mountain core. These operations were executed with methodical precision. Tight phalanxes moved silently through the mountain passes, following routes optimized for speed and surprise. The extraction process was highly organized. They focused on seizing portable wealth, grain, precious metals, and skilled labor. Once the resources were secured, the forces executed a disciplined retreat back into the Zagros before a counteroffensive could be mounted. The Mesopotamian military, which relied on heavy chariots, could not pursue the Elamites into the vertical terrain of the mountains. Elam regulated the growth of the lowlands for millennia, sustained by a geography and a political structure that resisted the traditional tools of conquest.